Welcome to a very special episode of The Platformer Chronicles. Today we talk about one of my favorite subjects in the history of video games. Legendary mascot platformer characters such as Mario and Sonic and Gex. All of these kinds of characters such as Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot. They all have one major thing in common despite certain differences amongst the characters. They all had a trilogy. That's right. Back in the day, a trilogy was something special. It was a mark. It was showing that your series had reached a legendary status, that it was worthy of a trilogy. The creativity, the hard effort put into the games, the fandom, it all sparked more games. For a platformer star back in the 90s to reach a trilogy status meant that they had become entered into the Hall of Fame of platformer characters. However, looking back in time, while some platformer games received sequels, there were many that only got to 2 games and never got a third chapter. Lots of memorable platformer characters that never received a trilogy, such as Croc. Everyone who grew up back in the 90s and the early 2000s remembers this character. He was really memorable, he had funny lines, and his first 2 games were pretty great, although the controls were a little weird and stiff, but it didn't matter to me. I loved the world, I loved the characters, I loved the graphics, and the music. Croc was a great game series in its heyday. Yes, the Croc games did have a bunch of weird phone games later on in the 2000s and the 2010s and some shit like that. And those are kind of decent, not gonna lie. But the original first two Croc games are really what made this character memorable to people. And I'm sure all the big Croc fans out there would have wanted to see a Croc 3, but it never came to light. Perhaps the most famous example of a really big, famous, beloved duo of platformer stars of Banjo and Kazooie never received banjo-threeie, which was hinted at the very end of banjo-tooie when you beat the game. The original Banjo-Kazooie is one of the greatest games ever, not just of platformers, but just of video games in general. And it was the biggest hit for the N64 by far. And it's really the golden standard of a 3D platformer, far superior to Super Mario 64. Its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, beloved by many and disliked by people who have bad taste. I absolutely love Banjo-Tooie, and I played the hell out of it back in the day. In many ways, the original could possibly be better than the sequel, but they're both fucking amazing. Unfortunately, we never got to the 3rd chapter, and I don't consider Nuts and Bolts, that crappy piece of whatever, I don't consider that to be part 3. What other examples of platformer characters can you think of that didn't reach number 3? What about the medieval games? Sir Daniel, you only received 2 games. Was he not popular enough? These kind of questions enter my mind when I think about the past. Why certain characters got trilogies and some never got it to number 3. Gex was a character that wasn't as popular as Mario and Sonic or Spyro or Crash, but he made a number 3. That's because the people who worked on Gex, who created Gex, they loved the character that much. They themselves wanted to see what else they could do with this character. It's a sign, in my opinion. Plus all the fans as well. The character of Abe, the famous character of Abe, the Oddworld games on the PS1, there was 2 of them and not a third. Another classic example. Another golden example is Tomba, pink-haired, crazy wild man who fought pigs back on the PS1 days. There was only Tomba 1 and 2, not a third title. And what about the blue bomber, Mega Man? There was Mega Man Legends 1 and 2, and not a third title. Mega Man especially is quite a bit more popular than these other characters I've already mentioned, but there was never a Mega Man Legends 3. I consider the Mega Man Legend games to be platformers, so what the hell was up with that? It almost happened years ago, but once again, didn't happen. Very, very, very sad for all the beloved fans of the Legends games from Mega Man. During what I would call the Silver Age of 3D platformers, the early 2000s, or the 2000s in general, had a lot of trilogies, actually. Jak and Daxter had a trilogy, Ratchet and Clank had a trilogy, Sly Cooper had a trilogy, and so did Ty the Tasmanian Tiger. I just find the whole trilogy of 3D platformers to be fascinating. It reminds me of the Star Wars trilogy and other famous trilogies throughout pop culture. What is it about a mascot character that gets them to number 3? Is it popularity? Is it desperation from the company? Is it a combination of both? Is it determination? Is it effort? Is it less effort? What is the reason behind it? And there's also many great, memorable 3D platformer stars that never got to number 2, such as Blasto, for example, or Jersey Devil, or Rascal, or Buck Bumble. There's lots of examples of game characters that never got to number 2. That's another thing to think about. Glover never got Glover 2, although a prototype was found, and it's a shame, thinking about what we could have gotten. Glover 2. Such a disgrace it never was released. I'll end this video with a very quick, funny story about my friend who I met when I worked for Toys R Us. And this was the final year, guys, that Toys R Us was still in business, and I was working there. And I became friends with this person who was the same age as me. And I told him how much I loved Gex back in the day, and he told me the character he loved the most back in those days was Blasto. That was his favorite game character, and mine was Gex. And we would tease each other about which character was better. And what was really amusing about it is that we all had different color shirts working at Toys R Us. And I just so happened to be wearing a green shirt, and he just so happened to be wearing a red shirt. So we would tease each other about that all the time, and I remember my favorite conversation I had with him. He goes to me, "Look, you're always bragging about Gex, but how many games did Gex have?" And I said, 5, because I counted the other 2 Game Boy games, because technically that's 5. And he just goes, "Yeah, Blasto had 1 game." "Yeah, all right. So stop bothering me about that. You got 5. I got 1. Okay? I got 1 fucking game, okay? So leave me alone about that shit. You got to have 5, you know? It's kind of amusing thinking about it now. The thing we were joking to each other about was like fans of baseball arguing about which team had more championships than the other. It was us reminiscing about the late 1990s and how special it was to grow up during that time period, and to grow up with all these colorful, amazing characters such as Bomberman, Croc, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro the Dragon, all that great stuff. And actually, my favorite platformer star of all time is the great Crash Bandicoot. But I would put maybe Spyro, and then Sonic, and then Gex, something like that, and then Banjo-Kazooie. I would consider those 5 to be like the gold standard, really, of 3D platformers. I won't exclude Mario from that, but I think Mario had other games that were more than just the 3D platformers. So anyway, whether they got a trilogy, 2 games, or even 1 game, all these characters were memorable. And it's really interesting to look back in time and to think about which characters got a trilogy and which ones didn't. Let me know in the comments below what game character you wish had a trilogy and never received it. Thank you so much for watching. This is the Platformer Chronicles, signing out.